Hello, dear viewers. You're watching Battlefront Archives, the channel where we uncover little-known and hidden chapters of World War II history. If you're interested in unknown facts, dramatic stories, and shocking discoveries, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the notification bell. When the Second World War drew to its brutal end, the blood on the battlefields did not stop flowing. It merely changed direction. In 1945, nearly 8 million German soldiers found themselves in Allied captivity. For many of them, surrender did not mean safety. It meant retribution. From the Siberian gulags, where death came from frost and hunger, to the Rhine meadow camps, where prisoners perished from neglect, and the public executions in Prague and Yugoslavia. This episode is dedicated to the fate of those for whom the war had ended, but the nightmare continued.
When the Second World War came to its brutal end, the blood on the battlefields did not stop flowing. It merely changed direction. In 1945, nearly 8 million German soldiers laid down their arms. For some, surrender meant survival. For others, it marked the beginning of a new nightmare. Thousands were taken prisoner by the Allies, but captivity did not always bring safety. For many, the war was far from over. It simply moved behind barbed wire. Part 1. The Eastern Front. Retribution and the Gulag. In the East, mercy was in short supply. The Soviet Union did not see German soldiers as prisoners of war, but as enemies responsible for millions of deaths and the destruction of entire cities. Fueled by years of relentless propaganda and unimaginable suffering, revenge became an unspoken law. The message from above was clear. Take revenge. Show no pity to the enemy. Many German captives were executed on the spot. Columns of prisoners were paraded through ruined towns, beaten, humiliated, and jeered at by those who had lost everything. The long road east. Those who survived the chaos were loaded onto freight trains bound not for home, but for Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Urals. The journey itself was a death sentence for many. Weeks without food or water. Bodies thrown from the wagons along the way. Those who reached their destination found themselves in the vast network of Soviet labor camps, the Gulag. There, they were forced to rebuild the land they had helped destroy. Coal mines, railroads, forests frozen solid under 40 degrees below zero. Rations were scarce, a few slices of bread, a bowl of watery soup. Men worked until they collapsed, their bodies left in the snow. One dead prisoner meant one less mouth to feed. Historians estimate that up to 1 million German POWs perished in Soviet captivity. Official Soviet records claim around 450,000, but countless others simply vanished. Homecoming, 10 years later. For those who survived, the road home was long. The Soviet Union used German labor to rebuild its shattered industry and cities. Factories, bridges, power plants, all rose from the ground by the hands of former enemies. Only in 1955, after political negotiations, did the last German prisoners return home. They stepped off the trains, thin, gray, unrecognizable. 10 years older, haunted. Many came back to families who had already mourned them as dead. And in post-war Germany, there was little sympathy for soldiers who had fought for Hitler. The Bleiburg Massacre. One of the darkest chapters of this story unfolded in Bleiburg. In May 1945, thousands of German soldiers and their allies, Croatian Ustasha, Slovenians, Hungarians, sought to surrender to the British in Austria, hoping to escape the approaching Soviets. But instead, they were handed over to Tito's Yugoslav partisans. What followed was known as the Death Marches. Prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers without food, without water. Those who fell behind were shot on the spot. At the journey's end came mass executions. Bodies were dumped into ravines and abandoned mines. Mass graves are still being discovered in Slovenia today. Estimates range from 50 to 100,000 dead. Part 2. The Western Front. Vengeance, Chaos, and Silence. In the West, the rules of war technically applied. The Allies claimed to uphold the Geneva Conventions. But emotions, especially after the liberation of the death camps, often overpowered reason. Dachau. Retribution unleashed. On April 29, 1945, U.S. forces liberated Dachau. What they found defied belief. Piles of corpses, survivors barely able to stand. When several SS guards tried to surrender, they were gunned down on the spot. Witnesses recalled 30 to 50 executions before officers could restore order. The investigation that followed was quietly buried. It was not an isolated case. Across Europe, acts of revenge flared in the chaos of victory. French and Belgian resistance fighters executed SS men without trial. Local villagers looked on, some cheering, others in silence. The Rhine Meadow camps, Rheinwiesenlager. After Germany's surrender, the Western Allies faced a problem: millions of captives. By spring 1945, vast open-air camps appeared along the Rhine. They were called Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow camps. They were not death camps, but they were deadly nonetheless. Tens of thousands of men were held in fields surrounded by wire, without shelter, blankets, or sanitation. Rain turned the ground to mud. Food was scarce, sometimes just a few spoonfuls of oatmeal a day. Men died from exposure, dysentery, and starvation. U.S. officers described these camps as temporary. For thousands, they were permanent. The official death toll lists only a few thousand, but historian James Back, in his controversial work, claimed the number could reach 400,000. To this day, historians argue over the truth. Many records were destroyed, and silence became the final word. Silence and oblivion. After the war, these stories were buried under politics. The Soviets called their camps justice. The West called theirs necessity. Neither side wanted to speak of cruelty once peace was won. For the prisoners who lived through it, there was only silence. They came home to a divided Germany, a nation that no longer knew what to make of them. So they kept quiet, carrying the weight of those lost years alone. Epilogue. The Shadow of War. The fate of German prisoners of war is not a story of pity, but a story about the price of hatred. When a war ends, violence does not vanish. It merely changes its shape. Revenge, despair, indifference. They all left scars that would last for generations. Out of 8 million captured soldiers, hundreds of thousands never returned. Their graves stretch across Russia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Germany. Unmarked, forgotten. Their faces have faded from memory. But history remembers their silence, because war does not end on the day the guns fall silent. It continues in the hearts of those who survived. When Nazi Germany collapsed, the killing did not stop. It simply changed direction. Across a shattered Europe, vengeance became the new language of justice. For millions of German soldiers, surrender did not mean safety. It meant retribution. The Balkans. Vengeance without borders. In Yugoslavia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, revenge was not a distant policy. It was personal, immediate, and merciless. One of the bloodiest chapters began in May 1945, near the Austrian town of Bleiburg. Tens of thousands of German, Croatian, and Slovene soldiers surrendered to the British. They hoped for protection under Western custody. But instead, they were handed over to Tito's Yugoslav partisans. What followed was a tragedy known as the Bleiburg Massacre. The prisoners were forced into endless death marches. Weeks of walking without food, without rest, without mercy. Anyone who fell behind was shot. Entire columns of men and civilians vanished into the forests. Historians estimate between 40 and 100,000 were killed. The Yugoslav government buried the evidence. Literally. Mass graves filled with bones in German, Croatian, and Slovene uniforms are still being uncovered today. Silent witnesses of a vengeance that outlived the war. The Prague Uprising. In May 1945, as the Red Army closed in, Prague erupted in fury. Czech partisans and enraged civilians hunted down anyone in a German uniform. Captured soldiers, Gestapo agents, even policemen, dragged into the streets. Beaten, stripped, executed. Some were thrown from bridges into the Vltava River. Others were shot while begging for mercy. For the people of Prague, this was justice after years of terror. But for the victims, it was another chapter of chaos, where retribution became indistinguishable from cruelty. The Western Front. Chaos and neglect. On the Western Front, the Geneva Convention still stood, at least on paper. But in the chaos of victory, discipline often broke apart. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, resistance fighters who had lived under Nazi occupation took revenge. They hunted down retreating Germans. SS soldiers were shot in public squares, their bodies left hanging as warnings. For many, it was not justice. It was release. When Allied control collapsed. Even among Allied troops, rage sometimes eclipsed restraint. After the Malmedy massacre, when SS units executed American prisoners, word spread quickly. Soon, some U.S. soldiers refused to take SS men alive. "No SS," they shouted. "No mercy." Canadian forces were also involved in summary executions in Normandy, incidents later erased from official records. These moments were rarely spoken of. They did not fit the image of liberation. The Dachau Massacre. Then came Dachau, April 29, 1945. American soldiers entered the concentration camp and found thousands of corpses, stacked like wood. The smell of death was everywhere. Survivors were barely human, skeletal, silent, broken. When the SS guards surrendered, something inside the soldiers snapped. Without orders, they lined the guards against a wall and opened fire. Dozens were killed before officers intervened. It was not an act of justice. It was the eruption of human fury after staring into the face of hell. The Rhine Meadow Camps. After Germany's surrender, millions of soldiers were captured. The Allies were unprepared. To contain them, the Americans built enormous open-air enclosures, the Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine Meadow Camps. There were no barracks, no roofs, no beds, just barbed wire, mud, and rain. Prisoners slept on the ground, drank from puddles, and starved. Medical care was almost non-existent. Official U.S. records mention a few thousand deaths, but some researchers, like James Bach, claimed the toll reached hundreds of thousands. The truth remains buried, like so many of the men who never made it home. Silence and the legacy of revenge. When the war ended, Europe fell into silence. But it was not peace. It was amnesia. In post-war Germany, speaking of German suffering was taboo. The nation that had caused so much pain had no right to grieve. In the Soviet Union, every German death was portrayed as righteous vengeance. And in the West, darker episodes were simply forgotten. Documents about summary executions and secret transfers stayed locked for decades. Historians still debate. Where did justice end and vengeance begin? Even today, archaeologists uncover mass graves across Poland, Russia, and the Balkans. Bones of young men, dog tags rusted beyond reading, crosses without names. They are proof that for many, the war did not end in May 1945. It simply changed its face. Their story is a reminder of an uncomfortable truth. Vengeance, like war itself, has no victors, only survivors. And even in the moment of triumph, humanity can lose its soul.